Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world suspended delicately on the edge of change. A world where a single moment never happened and everything else quietly shifted in its place. Imagine it's a lazy summer morning in Sarajevo, the air thick with sun and smoke from cheap cigars. A man with a mustache and a pistol waits at a street corner, but his stomach growls. He leaves. He misses his shot. The Archduke lives, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere unexpected, post your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy community reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step onto cobblestones that never get washed in blood. There are no frantic telegrams, no ultimatums, just the gentle clinking of horse hooves against stone and a vendor selling figs. Europe exhales, the powder keg doesn't light, and you, floating unseen through this alternate timeline, find yourself wandering a continent that never got punched in the ribs. Franz Ferdinand, whose death should have kicked off a global cascade of madness, instead shrugs off his near miss with mortality. He'll later call it an annoying day with a strange sandwich detour. You chuckle, imagining how history books would have titled that one. Austria-Hungary, deprived of its excuse to smash Serbia, instead holds another pointless debate in its overcrowded parliament. Picture it. Aging men in tight collars, waving tiny spoons for emphasis, while the Balkans smolder quietly outside. Nothing new, really. Historians still argue whether the assassination could have truly been avoided. Maybe the car should have taken the right turn instead of the left. Maybe the route should have been changed more than once. But in this version, it is avoided. And that makes all the difference. Without the Franz Ferdinand incident, there's no cascading alliance panic. No Germany marching into Belgium just because. No Russia mobilizing out of pure Slavic brotherhood. Instead, everyone goes back to pretending everything is fine, like when you spill coffee on your shirt before a meeting and convince yourself no one will notice. France is relieved. Britain mildly irritated. It was just getting warmed up for something dramatic. And Germany? Well, Germany tightens its monocle and refocuses on opera. It's odd, isn't it? One man spared, and suddenly 20 million lives are too. Not right away, of course. The seeds of war are still there. Nationalism, empires clashing like bored titans, the suffocating weight of outdated monarchies. But for now, the steam is let off through less deadly means. More parades, more moustache competitions, fewer trenches. You stroll past Vienna cafes filled with men in bowler hats writing bitter letters about theatre critics. In Paris, artists paint sunsets instead of battlefields. Berlin hums with electricity, not from tanks, but from neon signs and zeppelins drifting lazily overhead. And Serbia still smolders, but it smolders alone. The Great War never begins, but the great tension lingers, like a kettle just barely not boiling. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the world doesn't need to explode to change. Maybe it just needs to hold its breath a little longer. You keep walking. You pass a bookstore that doesn't know it won't be bombed, a cafe that doesn't yet need to feed amputees, a train that still thinks it's just a train, not a troop carrier. The quiet is uncanny, but peaceful. And somewhere, just out of sight, the future hesitates, just for a moment. You follow the scent of roasted chestnuts down a narrow cobblestone lane, where pigeons flutter lazily, and the air carries only the sounds of midday bells and the occasional sigh of a bored carriage driver. The war that never came leaves Europe oddly serene, like a theatre stage reset after a nearly missed performance. The world holds its breath, but nobody knows why. Inside smoky salons and wood-panelled rooms, diplomats sip brandy instead of drafting ultimatums. There are no secret alliances unraveling like badly tied shoelaces, no telegrams screaming across borders with declarations of war. Just long-winded discussions over whether Bulgaria should be allowed more coastline on its stamps. You lean on the cool marble banister of the Foreign Office in London. A clerk sneezes, ruining his own ink blot. The headlines in the Times focus on crop yields and the Queen's corgi catching a cold. The Prime Minister is still grumbling about Irish Home Rule, unaware that in another version of history he'd be buried under casualty reports and telegrams marked urgent. Without the Archduke's assassination, the July crisis dissolves like sugar in tea. Austria-Hungary sends a strongly worded letter to Serbia, which Serbia promptly ignores. Germany leans over to back its ally, but finds there's no real fight to join. Wilhelm II, always more bark than bite, returns to admiring his naval fleet in miniature form. He names one of the toy ships the reasonable compromise. Historians still argue whether Europe would have found another excuse. Some say war was inevitable, like a sneeze held too long. But here, that sneeze never comes. Not this year. The diplomats, freed from catastrophe, go on vacation. Literally. The French ambassador heads to the Riviera. The Russian foreign minister organizes an opera-themed retreat in the Urals. Even the British Parliament shuts down early for a cricket match. You spot a memo from the German Chancellor. If nothing explodes by Thursday, we're going yachting. And with that, the tension drains. Not all at once, but like a slow leak from a bicycle tire. You hear it, faintly. That soft hiss of history being rewritten. There are still tensions, of course. France eyes Alsace-Lorraine like a jealous ex. Russia squints toward the Balkans, trying to remember why it cared so much. But without a flashpoint, none of it burns. The Balkans return to their usual chaos, localized, confusing, and mostly ignored by the rest of the continent. You pause by a newspaper kiosk in Budapest. Headlines read, "New accord reached on Danube shipping. No need for panic," says Finance Minister. An opera singer's wig causes minor scandal. It's blissfully boring. You don't realize how odd it feels until you picture the same kiosk in another timeline, smudged with soot and shattered glass. Bureaucracy expands to fill the void. You float past a government building in Brussels, where a 5-hour meeting debates the size of official stamps for export documents. They never reach consensus. One clerk rolls his eyes. "I miss the adrenaline," he whispers to no one in particular. Without war, European governments drown themselves in paperwork instead of blood. It's not peace out of love. It's peace out of inertia. Like the world wanted to crash but couldn't agree on the time. You glance across a map in a diplomat's office. It's the same Europe, you know, borders still complicated, hatred still alive but calmer, softer around the edges, and faintly absurd. A Serbian official tries to stir trouble by giving a fiery speech about imperialism. The audience claps politely and goes back to their lemonade. An Italian duke suggests forming a Mediterranean coalition. Everyone agrees it's a charming idea, then promptly forgets about it. You chuckle. It's not utopia, but it's not apocalypse either. And as the sun sets over this strangely balanced continent, you realize the most powerful thing in the world right now is boredom. And maybe that's the safest timeline of all. You drift north now, letting the air grow colder as rooftops steepen and sausages get longer. Germany stretches before you, wide, organized, and quietly smug. In this world without war, the German Empire is intact, unshaken, and somehow even more convinced of its cultural brilliance. Kaiser Wilhelm II stands at a balcony in Berlin, not to rally troops, but to unveil a new public library. He waves like a man who believes he's single-handedly holding Europe together with a monocle and sheer willpower. The crowd claps politely, more interested in the bratwurst cart behind them. Germany without war does what Germany does best. Invents things, debates loudly, and occasionally gets distracted by romantic poetry. Without the distraction of the Western Front, the country doubles down on technology, philosophy, and unnecessarily elaborate pastries. You wander through laboratories where physicists talk to themselves in dense equations and smell faintly of boiled cabbage. Historians still debate whether the German Empire could have survived without the crisis that gave it a sense of purpose. Some argue it was already fraying, too many kingdoms under one imperial roof. Others insist it was poised for greatness, so long as nobody asked it to share. Here, in this alternate stream of time, Germany leans into its intellectual side. You peek into a classroom, where young students argue Hegel versus Nietzsche with the passion other countries reserve for sports. Across town, a group of engineers work on electric trams powered by static from wool coats. It doesn't work, but they get a patent anyway. Culturally, Berlin explodes, not from bombs, but from cabaret shows, new theatre movements, and philosophical journals with names like Being and Sauerkraut. You can almost smell the ink on thick paper, hear the scratch of fountain pens, the dramatic sighs of moustached poets who never saw the trenches. Germany's military still exists, of course. Officers still polish their boots and march dramatically, but without war, they become more ceremonial than strategic. One general founds a marching band that tours elementary schools. Another starts a series of memoirs titled Battles I Would Have Fought. They sell modestly well, and with no war draining the economy, the country has money, serious money. You step into a Banker S office in Frankfurt, where financial deals hum across telegraphs and speculative markets soar. There's no reparations to worry about, no occupation zones, no sudden inflation caused by crushing defeat. The mark stays strong, the suits stay pressed, the champagne flows too often. You pass through a quiet field where, in another version of this reality, young men would have fallen by the thousands. Here, sheep graze. One of them sneezes. It's oddly emotional. The arts boom. Expressionism arrives early, but never grows teeth. Without the trauma of war, it becomes quirky rather than desperate. Painters explore mild discontent as a theme. One artist becomes famous for a series titled People Sitting in Slightly Uncomfortable Chairs. It's considered groundbreaking. Germany's colonies meanwhile become awkward. With no global war to stir them up, Berlin keeps them sort of. But resistance movements stir under the surface. You catch whispers of revolution in East Africa, soft at first, like a match never fully struck. In Cameroon, an educator starts teaching political theory under the guise of gardening lessons. Still, the empire endures, at least for now. You wander past the Brandenburg Gate just as the street lamps flicker on. Couples stroll arm in arm, a child drops a toy zeppelin in a fountain, and someone plays a violin off-key on a nearby bench. The city exhales into the evening, unaware of how close it came to rewriting itself in fire. In this version of Germany, you realize the dreams are still big, but the scars never form. That changes the dreams, makes them weirder, gentler, less desperate, and somehow that makes this place feel even more unreal. You take a slow train south through alpine passes toward a patchwork empire stitched together with stubborn tradition and questionable cartography, Austria-Hungary. The air grows thinner, and so does the patience of bureaucrats trying to keep 16 nationalities politely ignoring each other. In the world you know, war postponed the empire's decay, briefly uniting it against a common enemy. But here, without the pressure cooker of World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire unravels more like a comedy of errors. You drift through smoke-filled ministries, where translators still argue over whether Slovene documents should be folded vertically or horizontally. The Emperor Franz Joseph, somehow still alive, still slightly annoyed, still wearing the same uniform as always, spends most of his days reviewing rail budgets and pretending Croatia doesn't exist. He signs edicts with the enthusiasm of someone ordering wallpaper. Historians still argue whether Austria-Hungary might have reformed itself if war hadn't intervened. Some say it was a sinking ship, Others claim it was simply too proud to float straight. Here, though, it's more like a paddle boat spinning in place, technically moving but not going anywhere. You sit in on a parliamentary debate in Vienna. The Hungarian delegation wants more autonomy. The Czech representative argues for federalization. The Slovenes bring biscuits to soften the mood. Meanwhile, the Bosnian envoy starts reading poetry halfway through the session, and no one stops him. Without the threat of Serbian aggression forcing anyone's hand, the central government tries compromise after compromise. You watch the empire slide slowly toward irrelevance, not collapse. No explosions, no revolutions, just 1,000 missed opportunities and 24 new stamps. The empire becomes a museum of itself. Elegant cities, elegant trains, elegant decline. In Prague, artists joke that the empire now exists mostly to provide them with grants. Budapest hosts yearly festivals of imperial unity, which everyone attends ironically. Even Vienna leans into nostalgia. Street vendors sell chocolate kaisers, and schoolchildren rehearse oaths to an emperor they no longer believe in. But here's the thing, without war, there's no rush to leave. No crisis demanding borders. No outside force telling anyone it's time to pick a side. You walk through towns where people speak 3 languages in one sentence and can't remember which passport they technically hold. It's confusing. It's inefficient. It's also kind of beautiful. The military, such as it is, still drills in pristine uniforms. Officers invent new salute variations to keep morale up. One unit becomes obsessed with synchronized coffee pouring. You pass by their practice session and get splashed by a rogue espresso. Out in the provinces, tension simmers. Nationalists are still nationalists, but without the rallying cry of war, their momentum stalls. You overhear a group of Serbian students planning a protest. They get distracted by accordion music and forget their manifesto. You visit Sarajevo again. No gunshots. Just the usual market bustle, the occasional argument over fish prices, and a mild obsession with sour cream. The empire starts outsourcing its dysfunction. Minor disputes become court cases that last decades. Entire neighborhoods are funded just to house retired diplomats. You peek into an official archive and discover a 10-year debate over whether carriage horses should wear decorative sashes. You smile. Without war, Austria-Hungary doesn't explode. It evaporates, slowly, absurdly, and somehow, peacefully. And by the time the old emperor finally lays down his pen, the empire is more suggestion than state. But still, it hums with life. Cafes stay open late. The trains, mostly, run on time. And somewhere in the background, a string quartet plays something that sounds vaguely like a lullaby. You cross a quiet border into France, where the air smells faintly of roasted chestnuts, old ink, and self-satisfaction. The streets of Paris hum not with urgency, but with a low, deliberate rhythm, like a country stretching after a long nap, instead of recovering from a nightmare. In this version of the world, France has no Verdun, no Somme, no shredded countryside to rebuild. Instead, it has time. You wander past sidewalk cafes where philosophers argue about the ethics of butter. Young artists sketch each other under the forgiving glow of gas lamps. Somewhere in Montmartre, a cat sits on a piano that never had to drown out the sound of artillery. You listen for the echoes of war and hear only the clinking of spoons against porcelain. With no need to mobilize for conflict, France leans hard into culture. Painters, writers, and surrealists multiply like rabbits. You peek into a bookstore where the new releases shelf contains 7 volumes of poetry about umbrellas. One is illustrated with beet juice. Historians still debate whether France could have withstood another century of ennui without war to shake it. Some say trauma forces reinvention. Others argue that peace, given enough time, does the same, just with better lighting and more wine. Here, the Belle Époque never really ends. Art Nouveau overstays its welcome. Corsets make a brief comeback, Purely for the aesthetics, the Eiffel Tower gets painted more often than it probably needs to be. Someone starts a campaign to rename it Le Très Grand Hat Stand. You can't tell if they're joking. And jazz? Oh, jazz still happens. Just sooner. With no American doughboys arriving with records and swing in their pockets, French musicians turn inward. They blend classical with street music. One prodigy invents accordion blues. It goes exactly as well as you'd expect. Still, smoky cellars echo with strange, slow rhythms that put people to sleep and sometimes wake them up differently. You stroll past a group of university students staging a performance art piece involving baguettes and interpretive moping. They call it La Fatigue Existentielle. The audience nods solemnly and takes notes. Outside of Paris, rural France changes more subtly. With no trenches gouged into its farmland, the countryside remains whole. Soft hills, lazy cows, church bells that chime like they're sighing. You ride a bicycle through wine country where the only thing being crushed is grapes. The military, though smaller, remains proud. French generals argue about uniform buttons instead of battle strategy. One regiment invents a ceremonial march inspired by mime routines. It becomes strangely popular in Belgium. And colonial tensions? Still there, but softened. With fewer dead sons to justify expansion or revolt, the push-pull dynamic simmers instead of boiling. In Algiers, French officials host tea ceremonies with local leaders that are 90% performative and 10% genuine progress. Politically, France is a mess, but it's a fashionable, wine-drunk mess. You sit in on a debate in the Chamber of Deputies. Half the room is arguing about taxation. The other half is arguing about whether taxation exists. Someone falls asleep. The only thing they agree on is that nobody trusts the Germans, even when the Germans aren't doing anything. But in this timeline, that distrust stays mild. A background hum instead of a siren. You walk past a memorial park in Lyon, empty, no names engraved, no statues of weeping angels clutching helmets, just a fountain shaped like a rooster and a plaque that reads, "Peace is boring, but we'll take it." In another life, France would have lost over 1 million young men, entire villages emptied. Families shattered. But here, those sons still laugh in schoolyards, kiss under bridges, and argue over football matches. They write bad poetry and start small businesses. They grow old. And France, for all its tension and snobbery, remains intact. Not perfect, not even particularly efficient, but whole. And sometimes that's enough. You board a slow ferry across the Channel, gliding past grey waters that don't yet know they'll be called the English Channel. Britain, from this sleepy sea-level vantage, looks like a painting that someone forgot to update. Stone spires, smokestacks, and the occasional cow chewing contemplatively near a hedge. No bomb craters, no blackout curtains, just the damp, dignified calm of a country still clinging to its top hat. You dock in Dover and wander inland, where the year is something like 1914, but the soul is still somewhere in the 1890s. Without the First World War to fracture its self-image, Britain doubles down on being Britain. Empire, etiquette, eccentricity. You can almost hear the Queen's English echoing off the cobblestones. You drift past a shop window where mannequins display corsets, monocles, and teapots. One of them holds a tiny Union Jack and a sign that reads, "Keep calm and purchase biscuits." The empire isn't just intact, it's smugly polished. Historians still argue whether Britain's late Victorian cultural bubble would have popped without the war. Some say it would have modernized regardless. Others insist that only total upheaval could have shaken its powdered wig loose. Here, though, it just keeps going, and going, and going. You sit through a polite but incredibly long dinner party in Surrey, where the main topic of conversation is whether mustard spoons should be made of silver or ivory. Someone brings up continental politics, but is quickly silenced by a cough and a request for the trifle. The royal family continues smiling and waving, blissfully unbothered. King George V enjoys a reputation as a reliable moustache with a crown. Parliament passes important legislation like the Proper Width of Umbrella Handles Act. You're not sure if that one was a prank. London expands, but cautiously. The underground grows by 2 stops. Horse-drawn cabs still outnumber motor cars. An inventor in Bristol is working on a prototype for an electric scone warmer. It catches fire. Twice. Still gets funded. Without war, the suffrage movement takes longer to catch fire, but when it does, it's even more dramatic. You peek into a courtroom where a suffragette is defending her right to shout, "Votes for women!" from the back of a moving zeppelin. The judge sighs, adjusts his wig and grants a partial injunction. She may shout, but only during daylight hours. The British Army, lacking a battlefield, becomes ceremonial to the point of absurdity. You watch a regiment rehearse a bayonet salute to Queen Victoria's ghost. They take it very seriously. In one barracks, a colonel gives a rousing speech about the importance of ironing. Meanwhile, the colonies continue pretending not to notice the cracks forming at the edges of imperial control. India's independence movement is still whispering, but growing louder. Gandhi, not distracted by war, starts publishing pamphlets a decade earlier. They're banned immediately, then secretly copied by schoolchildren in Delhi. In Africa, Britain's control remains largely unchallenged for now. With no European war to pull troops away, the empire doubles down on surveys, bureaucracy, and making sure nobody's having too much fun. You pass a post office in Nairobi, staffed entirely by bored men in starched uniforms, debating the placement of commas. There's no rationing, no bombings, no patriotic recruitment posters plastered over pubs, but there's still pride, deep, dusty, and increasingly outdated. Britain becomes a country so in love with its traditions that it forgets to check if they still matter. You sit on a bench in Hyde Park next to a retired colonel who tells you the same story 3 times about Queen Victoria misplacing her umbrella. You nod along. The story gets funnier each time, and yet for all its charming eccentricity, something odd stirs beneath the surface. Young poets grow restless. Workers begin to strike, not for glory, but for tea breaks. A playwright stages a satire about Parliament being replaced by pigeons. It's banned for emotional ambiguity. You smile as the bells of Big Ben chime softly over a city that doesn't each yet realize it's drifting sideways through time. Britain hasn't broken, but it hasn't changed much either. Sometimes peace preserves, sometimes it embalms. You journey eastward now, your breath fogging in the cold, as the landscape stretches into forests, plains, and the great silence of uncertainty. Welcome to the Russian Empire. Still vast, still brooding, and still teetering like a bear on a tightrope. Only this time, there's no great war to knock it off balance. The Tsar still sits on his throne. For now. You pass through Petrograd, still called St. Petersburg actually, since there's no need to rename it during wartime. The streets are thick with coal smoke and conversation. Everyone is waiting for something, but nobody quite knows what. Nicholas II remains on the throne, stiff and earnest, with the face of a man who prays before opening his mail. He's not a great leader, but he's consistent, like a clock that runs 5 minutes late every day. With no war to exhaust the country or expose its failings in fast forward, his reign limps on like a worn-out boot. Historians still debate whether the Romanovs could have held on without World War I. Some say the revolution was coming anyway, just a matter of time. Others argue the war was the spark, the fuel and the fan all at once. But here, in this warless version of Russia, the revolution doesn't vanish. It just slows down, like molasses on a Siberian morning. You slip into the Winter Palace, where chandeliers glimmer over pointless meetings. The Tsarina continues trusting mystics, and Rasputin still lurks in the background like a hairy rumor. He hasn't been assassinated yet, but people are getting creative. Someone recently tried to poison his boots. Out in the countryside, things fester. Peasants still toil. Landowners still preen. There's no sudden draft pulling millions from the fields, but there's also no reform. Russia remains a feudal empire, dressed up as a modern state, and even the paint is peeling. In Moscow, political pamphlets circulate in secret. Lenin's writings spread slowly but persistently, less like wildfire, more like mildew. Without the chaos of war to smuggle him back into the country, Lenin remains a nuisance abroad. Still writing, still planning, still muttering about dialectics in Swiss cafes while trying not to look cold. Meanwhile, the Duma, a sort of political theatre troupe, continues pretending it has real power. Debates rage over things like grain tariffs and the appropriate length of imperial parades. One member tries to propose a bill allowing women to ride bicycles without a male chaperone. It fails spectacularly, but the cracks are there, the hunger, the inequality, the rage. Without war, it doesn't erupt, it simmers. You hear it in whispered songs on factory floors, in the clenched fists of workers who can't afford winter boots, in the eerie quiet of villages with too many ghosts and not enough bread. There are fewer strikes, less blood in the streets, but the anger doesn't go away, it just waits. You walk past a schoolhouse where a teacher lectures on Tolstoy and sneaks in a few quotes from Marx when no one is looking. A student raises their hand. What if the future is circular, they ask. The teacher blinks. Then let's hope it's padded. The Russian Orthodox Church, still powerful, still bearded, still vaguely suspicious of mirrors, clings to tradition like it's the only thing holding the roof up. You step into a candlelit cathedral where the scent of wax and incense fills your lungs. The priest says nothing, just watches the door, and the army, oh, it drills in the snow, with sabers and boots and great beards, but there's no war to harden it, no trenches to test it, just frostbite and boredom. A colonel complains that the greatest challenge his men face this year is morale fatigue brought on by excessive tea. Russia doesn't collapse in this timeline, not yet, but it sags, like an old painting behind cracked glass. The colors still vivid, but fading at the edges. And as the night settles in, you listen to the quiet unrest of a nation that knows something is coming, but hasn't decided what to call it yet. Minarets rise above dusty rooftops, and the scent of lamb, cardamom, and sea salt pulls you through a market older than memory. This is the Ottoman Empire, still standing, still sprawling, and still pretending everything's fine. Without the war to finish it off, the sick man of Europe keeps limping along. Not healthy, not dying, just oddly stable. You walk past a group of children playing beside a crumbling aqueduct. They argue in Arabic, Kurdish, and Armenian. None of them realize their ancestors were supposed to vanish in this century. Historians still debate whether the Ottoman Empire could have survived without World War I. Some say its collapse was inevitable, a slow burn under its own contradictions. Others argue that the war is what pushed it over the edge, bled it dry, then carved it up. But in this version of reality, there's no Treaty of Sèvres, no British-backed Arab revolt, no moustached foreign generals promising freedom for oil. Instead, the empire wakes up, barely. A string of half-hearted reforms starts trickling in. The Sultan, now more ceremonial than commanding, is talked into a constitutional monarchy he doesn't really understand. Bureaucrats in fez hats write long memos about decentralization. Most are ignored. Some are used to wrap fish. And yet, something shifts. Not because the empire is wise, but because it's tired. Tired of bleeding borders. Tired of uprisings. Tired of pretending it's still the same power that once knocked on the gates of Vienna. You step into a modest school in Damascus, where girls learn algebra and poetry. It's new, it's delicate, but it exists. In Istanbul, reformers gather in smoky cafes. They speak in cautious Turkish, slip into French when unsure, and always keep one eye on the door. You overhear a soft argument about trains, how to build more, how to standardize schedules, and whether passengers should be allowed to bring goats. The Young Turks still plot in the background, but their cause lacks urgency. No Gallipoli, no massive troop losses, no empire-wide crisis to exploit. So they bicker instead about oil rights, education, and how to make their revolution sound less French. Meanwhile, the provinces hum with quiet contradiction. In Baghdad, an imam reads Persian poetry under a British gas lamp. In Jerusalem, rabbis, sheikhs, and Orthodox priests all nod to the same tired soldier on patrol. Nobody likes the Ottoman tax collector, but nobody shoots him either. Armenians remain cautious, watchful, alive. There's no genocide in this timeline, no death marches, just tension, suspicion, and the slow, exhausting work of coexistence. You float past a workshop in Smyrna where an inventor is building a water pump powered by wind and mules. It doesn't work. He shrugs, adds another mule. Somewhere in the background, someone is writing a folk song about the experiment. The Ottoman army, once feared, now resembles a theatre troupe with too many officers and not enough boots. You attend a military parade where half the rifles are wooden and the other half are borrowed. The drummer falls asleep mid-march. And yet, things don't fall apart. There are still revolts, still corruption, still crumbling walls and whispers of independence from every corner. But there is no foreign invasion to unify the rage, no battlefield to martyr the cause, just slow erosion, like waves wearing down a fortress. One scholar in Cairo writes an essay titled "The Empire as Mirage." It's banned, of course, but copies circulate in secret, tucked into prayer books and recipe scrolls. And as the call to prayer rises into the twilight sky, you sit on a rooftop and stare out over a city that has, against all odds, refused to vanish. Not by strength, not by brilliance, but by staying too stubborn to die. The wind grows louder as you cross the Atlantic, not with gunfire or torpedoes, but with the lazy flap of sails and the low hum of a peaceful world going about its business. You drift into the United States of America, still firmly isolationist, still slightly arrogant, and still absolutely certain that everything important happens between New York and San Francisco. It's the year 1915, but without war on the horizon, America doesn't gear up for anything other than baseball season, and a debate about whether people should trust canned meat. The stars and stripes hang from porches. Jazz hasn't yet taken over, but ragtime pianos clink away in bar rooms with wooden floors and warm beer. Woodrow Wilson, still president, isn't dragged into a European catastrophe. Instead, he spends his energy on domestic policy and trying to look intelligent, while someone else handles actual decisions. He hosts long lectures in the White House garden about the soul of democracy, while his vice president dozes nearby. Historians still debate whether the US could have stayed out of the Great War, even if it had started. Some claim American neutrality was always temporary, an illusion wrapped in rhetoric. Others argue that without U-boats and the Lusitania, the country would have continued minding its own business indefinitely. Here, in this timeline, there is no war to draw them in. Just a distant continent behaving itself for once. You float through Manhattan's Lower East Side, where immigrant families crowd into tenements, not because their sons were drafted, but because the rent's still too high. Newsboys shout headlines like "Chicago invents new sausage shape" and "Europe still boring, experts say." Factories hum without switching to munitions. Ford is still building Model Ts, not ambulances. And nobody's handing out victory bonds on street corners, just chewing gum, sermons, and bad love poems. In Kansas, farmers grumble about weather, not war. You pass a barn with a painted sign that reads, "The cow's still done to care who's king of Austria." It's not wrong. Politically, America stays inward-looking. There's no Espionage Act, no Red Scare, no Wilson Crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Instead, You find a public more concerned with baseball batting averages and whether or not men should wear bow ties with suspenders. The answer still unclear. Social tensions simmer, though. Without the war to accelerate societal shifts, the civil rights movement moves slower. More letters, fewer marches. African-American soldiers who never deploy don't come home with medals or new expectations. They come home with calluses and the same old racism. Progress creeps but doesn't charge. And women? They still fight for the vote. But without Rosie, the riveter and factory work to prove their worth, the arguments take a more theatrical turn. You sneak into a suffrage rally in Boston, where actresses stage a mock parliament, one group wearing fake beards, the other wielding parasols. The mayor calls it provocative. Secretly, he's amused. Culturally, the US is still on track to invent modern celebrity. You pass a cinema where silent film star Mary Pickford signs autographs in white gloves. Across the country, a young boy named Walt is sketching a talking mouse. Nobody cares yet. They will. And though no war means no post-war boom, the economy grows at a steady clip. You sit in on a meeting of bankers who debate whether cotton futures or chewing gum are the better long-term investment. The answer, surprisingly, is both. In the Deep South, nothing much changes. Segregation still festers like a secret everyone refuses to speak aloud. There's no sudden wartime mobilization to force awkward integrations. You walk past a schoolhouse with 2 doors and 1 future. But in the cities, oh, things bubble. The Harlem Renaissance still comes, but slower, quieter. Without returning veterans demanding change, the arts seep in through poetry readings, barroom saxophones, and salons filled with cigarette smoke and half-sung protest songs. And as you stand atop a quiet hill outside Philadelphia, you realize America is still becoming America. Just at a slower pace, less adrenaline, more chewing, fewer drums, more banjos. It's not isolation, it's incubation. And in the quiet before the modern storm, the country yawns, stretches and dreams, still young, still messy, still convinced the rest of the world is just a rumor. You drift south now, the sun growing hotter as the map shifts from old colonial capitals to red clay roads and paper-thin borders. This is Africa in the early 20th century, a continent carved up by European hands, stitched together by railways and lies. But without World War I, something peculiar happens. The scramble slows, the rifles stay oiled but unused, and the absurdity of colonial rule becomes even more obvious. In another version of this world, African soldiers would be pulled into a global war they barely understood, fighting in European mud for empires that would forget them by the time peace was declared. But here, there is no mass conscription, no Senegalese rifleman sent to die in Champagne, no East African campaign dragging villages into starvation. Instead, the colonies simmer in awkward quiet. You float over British Nigeria, where colonial administrators sit in white linen suits, sipping gin, and failing to learn the names of the towns they govern. Without the war to strip resources and men, colonial governments double down on paperwork and parades. You peek into a dusty office where a British official argues passionately with a local scribe about the proper format for census categories. Goats are not dependents, he insists. Historians still argue whether Africa would have decolonized faster or slower without World War I. Some say the war broke the illusion of European invincibility. Others believe that, without the war, independence movements wouldn't have found their voice so soon. Here, though, the voice is already warming up. Quiet, yes, but persistent. In German East Africa, the famous guerrilla campaign of Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck never happens. No scorched earth. No dragged-out resistance, just crops, bureaucrats, and awkward German language lessons. You walk through Dar es Salaam, where a Swahili newspaper publishes poetry mocking the Kaiser's mustache. No one's arrested, mostly because no one in Berlin ever reads it. The infrastructure continues, but lazily. Railways are built with fewer deadlines, more bribes. One Belgian engineer in the Congo attempts to connect two rivers by strategic shoveling. It takes 3 years and ends in a swamp. Locals call it the white man's loop. You pass a group of students in Dakar discussing politics in French, Wolof, and occasional bursts of Latin. With no war pulling teachers away, education expands, quietly, unevenly, but surely. A young girl writes an essay titled, "Why Empires Tremble When We Learn to Read." Her teacher frames it on the wall. Meanwhile, in South Africa, tensions still brew. Without the distraction of global conflict, Afrikaner nationalism becomes more self-focused. You attend a church meeting where 3 men argue about Dutch spelling reforms for 90 minutes. The revolution, it seems, has been postponed for tea. Egypt simmers under British occupation. No Gallipoli means fewer troops, but the resentment still grows. You sit near the Nile, watching a small group of revolutionaries hand out leaflets disguised as religious tracts. One reads, "Let Pharaoh sleep, we have new gods now." In Ethiopia, still proudly independent, Emperor Menelik II's legacy endures without the pressures of colonial war encroachment. You pass a courtyard where a monk copies texts by hand as a wireless radio buzzes in the next room. It's a strange blend of timelines, ancient and modern, mingling without violence. Colonial powers still impose absurd rules. You see a British officer fine a village elder for excessive drum noise. The elder pays him in feathers and sends him home with a chicken. The officer never reports the incident. But beneath the comedy, the soil stirs. The lack of war means more attention on local resistance. Leaders like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah emerge a little earlier, not as veterans, but as students, writers, thinkers. Their voices are quieter now, but sharp, focused, planning. You walk through Accra, where a group of young men gathers beneath a fig tree, debating whether independence should be gradual or immediate. They laugh, share peanuts, and start drafting a constitution on the back of a bread wrapper. Without war, Africa remains colonized, but the empire's grip softens, not by mercy, by distraction, by decay. The metropoles don't send more soldiers, they send more telegrams, more maps, more inspectors who are allergic to mangoes. And as the sun sets over a calm savannah where no trenches were ever dug, you realize this continent, so often dragged into wars it didn't start, is now writing a different story, still quiet, but less patient. You ride the warm wind east, across oceans and islands, into a continent that has been watching, silently, carefully, as the Western powers jostle and lurch. This is Asia, and in a world where World War I never erupted, Asia's awakening takes a different form, slower, more strategic, and wrapped in its own brand of simmering resentment. First stop, Japan. The land of the rising sun still industrializes, hungrily, but without the distraction of a world war to exploit, its imperial ambitions become more patient. You stroll through Tokyo, where the streets buzz with rickshaws, gas lamps, and students quoting Hegel between sips of green tea. The Meiji Restoration still echoes through the institutions. The Navy still drills. But there's no German colonial base in Shandong to seize, no Versailles Treaty to strong-arm for concessions. Historians still argue whether Japan's rise to militarism required the First World War. Some claim the war emboldened it. Others say the ambition was there already, just waiting for oxygen. In this version of history, Japan smolders more than it flares. For now. You sit in a quiet izakaya in Osaka, where 2 scholars debate the morality of empire using haiku. One of them spills sake on his notes and declares it a metaphor. Nobody laughs. Meanwhile, China, oh China, remains fragmented. Warlords still strut across provinces like theater actors with real guns. But without a foreign power vacuum left by distracted Europeans, the civil disorder is slightly less theatrical. There's no Japanese seizure of Manchuria in 1931. Yet. No Versailles betrayal to sour the already fragile post-Qing diplomacy. You pass through Beijing, where students hold small protests about land reform and currency inflation. They chant slogans into the wind, their faces half covered in cloth, not because of tear gas, but because the coal smoke is just that bad. The Qing dynasty is long gone, but its shadow lingers in paper scrolls and old courtyards. There is no unified nationalist movement yet, just threads of it, winding through cities like nervous electricity. A teacher in Shanghai scribbles New China on a chalkboard, then erases it just as quickly. His students notice. Without European colonial powers distracted by trench warfare, they double down on their holdings. The British maintain their grip on Hong Kong. The French keep their foothold in Indochina. You float through Hanoi, where a young man named Nguyen Ai Quoc writes quietly in a cramped room, wondering if the world will ever listen to his dreams of liberation. Spoiler, they will, but not yet. In India, something curious is happening. With no promise of citizenship for wartime service, no mass recruitment of Indian soldiers into foreign battles, the independence movement develops along different lines, more literary, more philosophical, less defined by betrayal. Gandhi, still Gandhi, starts organizing local resistance with the same quiet precision, spinning wheels instead of bayonets, salt instead of rifles. You observe a village meeting under a banyan tree, where elders and students debate British taxation and the moral implications of swatting flies. It's civil until someone brings up cricket, then things get heated. But there are no Jallianwala Bagh massacres in this timeline, no British officers panicking over sedition. The colonial order still clutches power, but with less justification, fewer martyrs, and more whispered doubt. Even in places like Siam and the Dutch East Indies, the power dynamics shift subtly. You pass through Jakarta, where school children sing nationalist songs between Dutch grammar lessons. The Dutch pretend not to hear them. In Korea, still under Japan's control, resistance movements brew in monasteries and coffee shops. Without the distraction of a global conflict, the Japanese Empire pays closer attention here. That's not good news, but it's also not genocide. Not yet. And throughout the continent, something is growing. Not revolution, not rebellion, just memory. Memory of treaties never honored, of promises never made, of leaders who never notice the ink drying on another man's map. You stand atop a hillside in Burma and hear a monk tell his followers, "A quiet land doesn't mean a content one." They nod, then they go back to planting rice. Asia, in this world, is not passive. It is not sleeping. It is simply watching. Watching Europe pretend it's not fragile. Watching America pretend it's not involved. And waiting. You find yourself gliding across a map where lines never got redrawn, treaties never signed, and fingers never pointed in Versailles. The Great War never happened, and so neither did the Treaty of Versailles, the document that, in another version of history, carved up empires with a pen dipped in vengeance. Without it, the victors never rise, and the defeated never fall, because there are no victors and no losers. You drift through Paris in early spring, where flower carts clatter over cobblestones and diplomats attend conferences more focused on fisheries than front lines. There's no need for a peace summit, because the war that required peace never came. The Hôtel des Reservoirs and Versailles remains just another elegant building, not a stage for historical melodrama. Historians still debate whether a treaty like Versailles was inevitable. Some say Europe's desire to punish would have surfaced eventually. Others argue the war's trauma gave the treaty its teeth. Without trenches and gas masks, there is no appetite for retribution. There is no stab-in-the-back myth. No reparations bill the size of Jupiter dropped onto Germany's doorstep. Instead, borders wobble, but don't collapse. Alsace-Lorraine remains a sore topic at French dinner parties, but doesn't change hands. Poland doesn't reappear yet, just a concept in exile, scribbled in journals by bearded men who write by candlelight and sigh a lot. The Ottoman Empire, still intact, isn't sliced up into mandates. Britain doesn't grab Iraq. France doesn't plant a flag in Syria. You float over a Damascus that's still Ottoman, still skeptical, but not yet carved into someone else's blueprint. In Africa, colonial borders remain as they were, still arbitrary, but not redrawn by a bunch of Europeans arguing in broken French over which river is more strategic. You visit a British officer in Khartoum whose greatest worry this week is whether the Queen's portrait should hang in the dining room or the latrine. He chooses both. And Germany? It doesn't bleed out in Versailles. It doesn't sign an armistice under duress or have its military gutted by foreign penmanship. Instead, it keeps its colonies, keeps its pride, keeps its emperor. For now. Without the treaty, the global balance of power doesn't lurch into imbalance. America doesn't get its brief taste of global arbitration before storming back into isolation. Wilson never gets to pitch his League of Nations. You sit in a classroom in Princeton where students snore through one of his idealistic lectures titled International Friendship and Other Fantasies. The League never forms, which means it never fails. That's something, right? Without Versailles, there is no psychological scar running through the heart of Europe. There's no setup for Act Two, no terms so harsh they practically script the next war. France remains wary, Britain stays smug. But Germany just keeps going, grumbling about Belgium, building opera houses, arguing over sausage classifications in the Reichstag. You wander through a quiet village in Bavaria where a young painter named Adolf never quite finds his calling. There's no veteran's rage to fuel his speeches. No trench trauma to twist his nationalism. He still rants sometimes to anyone who'll listen, but people mostly avoid him and his terrible moustache. With no Versailles Treaty to institutionalize resentment, radical ideologies struggle to take hold. You walk past a beer hall in Munich where socialists and monarchists yell over each other until they both get bored and go home. The barkeep shrugs and wipes the counter. There's still tension, still hunger, still class divide and national friction, but there's no cosmic humiliation to galvanize an entire generation. Just the slow, awkward shuffle of history, trying to find its next chapter without a proper villain. And as night falls over a Europe that never had its big peace moment, you realize something odd. The absence of Versailles hasn't fixed the world, but it has softened it. No treaties signed in marble halls. No ink soaked with revenge, just a world still waiting to decide what comes next. You float back into Central Europe now, gliding over quiet fields and towns that never heard the thunder of distant guns. In the Germany below, there's no red-splattered surrender, no Treaty of Versailles, and, most notably, no Adolf Hitler rallying angry crowds in beer halls with words like "stab in the back" and "race." Without World War I, the world misses its most infamous moustache. But that doesn't mean trouble doesn't find a new face. You hover over Linz, Austria, where a young Adolf still paces nervously outside the Academy of Fine Arts. This time he gets in. His paintings? Meh, but they sell well enough to fund a life of modest isolation and minor bitterness. He ends up teaching watercolor at a trade school in Graz. He has opinions, loud ones, but no audience. His life ends in obscurity, and the world moves on. Historians still debate whether someone like Hitler was inevitable. Some argue that fascism was already bubbling across Europe, and Hitler was merely its most dramatic symptom. Others believe that the cocktail of rage, loss, and humiliation birthed by the war was what allowed him to thrive. In this timeline, that cocktail was never served, but the ingredients still sit on the shelf. You walk the streets of Munich where political parties still jostle for attention. Monarchists want their thrones back. Socialists hold rallies with songs and soup. Nationalists hand out pamphlets with slightly too many capital letters. It's loud, but it's manageable. Nobody is winning. Nobody is storming any parliaments. That said, someone always fills a vacuum. You notice a new face rising in Germany. Not Hitler, but someone else. A polished ex-military officer, articulate and strangely charming, with a fondness for order and a concerning obsession with national destiny. Let's call him General Ernst Weiss. A fictional composite, yes, but eerily plausible. Weiss never saw the trenches, but he romanticizes them anyway. He gives stirring speeches about German greatness and the need for renewed identity. He doesn't scream. He speaks in low, calm tones. Somehow that's worse. He's less angry than Hitler, smarter too, which makes him harder to dismiss. You attend one of his rallies. No swastikas, just gold eagles and torchlight. The crowd is smaller, more subdued, but they listen, really listen. Without the trauma of war, Germany doesn't collapse into economic ruin, but it does stagnate. Inflation still bites, class tensions simmer, the monarchy lingers in name, powerless. People want direction. They want someone to make sense of a world that keeps changing without asking permission. Weiss offers vision, not vengeance. But under the velvet is steel. You float through a Berlin newspaper office where editors argue over whether to cover his growing movement. He's not dangerous, one says, just boring. You know better. In this world, extremism doesn't shout, it whispers. Italy, meanwhile, is having its own moment. No Mussolini either. No war means no disgruntled veterans forming black-shirt brigades. But nationalism finds a different path. An intellectual named Arturo Messina starts a publication called Order and Spirit. It blends Roman nostalgia, Christian virtue, and a hint of militarism. It's dry but persuasive. Think less jackboots, more Latin quotes and tailored suits. In both countries you see a strange theme. Where war once fueled fire, peace creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum new ideologies drift, not as explosions, but as fog. And yet, without Versailles, without mass death, without fields soaked in grief, the public is harder to sway, no broken families to radicalize, no youth crippled by mustard gas, just discontent, disillusion, the kind that builds slowly like a leak in a roof. So yes, there's no Hitler, but something else still knocks on the door, quieter, politer, still dangerous. And as you walk the quiet halls of a German university where students debate philosophy over cigarettes and doubt, you wonder, is evil easier to fight when it wears jackboots or when it wears a smile? You stroll through a quiet Berlin laboratory where wires, gears, and the soft smell of solder fill the air. The war that never happened hasn't stifled innovation, it's simply rerouted it. Without the urgent chaos of trench warfare and arms races, technology doesn't halt. It just grows, differently, slower, stranger. You observe an engineer testing a clunky biplane that's more beautiful than practical. There's no race to militarize the skies. Instead, aviation is still a gentleman's sport, a floating daydream, not yet a tool of devastation. The pilot lands gracefully, then offers you a cup of hot chocolate. You accept. Without World War I, the accelerated timelines for tanks, chemical weapons, rapid-fire field artillery, and mass logistics vanish. So do countless lives lost to experimentation in real time. The innovations that were once born from urgency now arise from curiosity and boredom. Historians still debate whether the war truly spurred progress. Some say necessity is the mother of invention. Others argue trauma is a poor substitute for patience. In this version of history, science takes its time and wanders into places no one expected. You walk through a French workshop where a young woman is building a prototype of something she calls a domestic cooler. She doesn't know it yet, but she's inventing the refrigerator. Meanwhile, across the channel in London, a man patents a machine that toasts bread on both sides. The world is scandalized. Medical science ambles forward with less pressure. No mass trauma means no sudden advances in prosthetics, but also no battlefield infections forcing surgeons to rethink hygiene at gunpoint. The antiseptic revolution arrives, just a bit late. Penicillin still lurks in the moldy corners of Alexander Fleming's lab, but nobody's desperate enough to notice it quite yet. You peer over his shoulder. He's writing about nasal bacteria and trying to keep his cat off the table. Still, public health does improve. Slower, yes, but cleaner water, better sewers, and that eternal miracle of daily soap reach wider populations. You hear an old doctor in Warsaw lecture about germ theory and the suspicious value of boiled linens. His students take notes. One adds doodles of a very judgmental germ. In the absence of war, communication tech blossoms for comfort, not command. Telephones become sleeker, less intimidating. You walk through a Viennese apartment where a young couple whispers sweet nothings through a homemade telephone line that spans across 2 balconies. It's romantic and slightly creepy. Cinema explodes early, not because people need distraction from horror, but because the world has time for stories. You attend a screening in New York where an entire audience gasps at a scene of someone dropping a pie. The film is 10 minutes long and has no title. The director is hailed as a genius. Radio takes longer to spread. Without wartime need for field communication, radio towers grow slowly. You visit a small studio in Prague where a DJ plays accordion polkas between readings of Czech poetry. 3 people are listening. All of them are related. And then there's energy. Without a global war demanding oil, coal stays king longer than it should. You float over soot-darkened rooftops and chimney forests that might have been phased out sooner if not for peacetime complacency. An inventor in Boston builds a solar oven. His neighbors think he's in a cult. Electric cars, still a novelty. Without military contracts pushing internal combustion engines, electric transport gets a tiny head start. You test drive a creaky, quiet vehicle in Paris that smells faintly of lavender and burns out on a hill. It's elegant and useless. In the arts, science blends with performance. You step into a Berlin theater where engineers showcase a mechanical puppet that writes haikus. It's impressive until it malfunctions and recites grocery lists. The audience applauds anyway. Technology in this world is not a runaway train. It's a bicycle with a tiny bell and a basket full of weird ideas. You realize something as you sit on a park bench beside a man holding blueprints for a mechanical dog that eats socks. War makes things go faster, but peace makes them go weirder, and sometimes weird is good. You glide now through quiet galleries and smoke-sweet cafes, where artists swirl paint not out of trauma, but out of curiosity, boredom, and the persistent question, what if blue was angry? In a world without World War I, art still evolves, but the path is meandering, more amused than anguished. You wander through Montparnasse, where a painter named Jean, who never lost a brother at Verdun because Verdun never happened, is experimenting with painting entire portraits using only triangles. He calls it emotional geometry. His dealer calls it very French. Without the war, the art world has no need to scream. Dada never quite emerges, because there's nothing horrific enough to reject. No gas masks, no amputations, no cratered landscapes to etch into canvas. Instead, there's a weird softness to everything. Abstract? Yes, but not haunted. Historians still debate whether art needs pain to evolve. Some claim trauma births originality. Others believe the absence of fear allows artists to explore without defense mechanisms. In this peaceful version of reality, expressionism becomes introspective, not explosive. You sit in a smoky Berlin parlor watching a man named Otto paint still lifes of clocks melting into bowls of soup. It's not a cry for help, it's a commentary on time and digestion. He explains it to his cat. The cat appears unimpressed. Surrealism still appears, but it's gentle. Less about escaping horror, more about indulging whimsy. You watch a short play titled The Hour the Umbrella Sang to the Moon in a Paris basement theatre. It features interpretive mime, live goldfish, and a man who refuses to stand up. Critics call it meaningless yet oddly calming. Without the shock of modern war, literature doesn't fragment. There's no trench poetry to break syntax and sense. Instead, novelists double down on lush language and long, meandering sentences about teacups, trees, and emotional fog. You skim a 700-page novel about a woman deciding whether to eat an apple. It ends ambiguously. You sigh, then read it again. In London, Virginia Woolf still writes, but her stream of consciousness flows more gently. The lighthouse remains. The waves lap, but do not crash. In America, the lost generation isn't so lost. Hemingway never sees the front lines, never becomes obsessed with clean prose and the trauma underneath. Instead, he writes longer stories, softer ones. One involves a fisherman who mostly just naps. You find yourself at an exhibit in Vienna titled The Shape of Thoughts. The artist has suspended dozens of white gloves from the ceiling. Each glove contains a quote about onions. The room smells faintly of mothballs and ambition. There are still movements, still manifestos. But they arrive like Sunday letters, not Molotov cocktails. The Italian futurists spend more time praising bicycles than speedboats. You watch one of them launch a magazine made entirely of hand-drawn gears. It flops. He becomes a pastry chef. The Bauhaus school still opens, but without war amputees and shattered cities as its fuel, its mission shifts. More focus on form and calmness. Chairs that don't make a statement, just hold you well. You test one, it's okay. You stroll past a wall in Prague where someone painted a mural of a sleeping moon, sipping coffee, while tiny clouds dance across its shoulders. A child touches the paint and whispers, "I think this one's dreaming about me." Public monuments, too, look different. There are no cenotaphs, no tombs of unknown soldiers, no bronze men charging forward into nothing. Instead, you find fountains shaped like books, statues of people hugging, and the occasional pigeon perched proudly on a sculpture titled Stillness. And music? Music thrives. Stravinsky still shocks people, but for fun, not fury. Jazz spreads slowly across Europe. With no wartime marching bands to feed it, it grows like ivy. Playful, strange, occasionally sultry. In a smoky Copenhagen bar, a woman sings in French and Swedish, backed by a pianist who never served, but has feelings anyway. Without war, art doesn't need to be therapy. It becomes conversation, a little eccentric, a little self-indulgent, but deeply human. And as you lean against a rain-damp sculpture of a melting spoon cradling a daisy, you smile. The world didn't scream. So art decided to whisper. You wander through a poppy field in northern France, but here the red blooms aren't symbols of loss. There are no war graves beneath this soil, no shattered helmets, no hollow-eyed memorials carved into stone. In this version of history, the poppy never becomes a metaphor. It's just a flower, beautiful but empty of mourning. Without World War I, the cultural memory of death doesn't get wrapped in barbed wire and bugles. Nations still have their histories, still carry old wounds, but they don't share the common trauma of mechanized slaughter. You pass through a village square where, in another world, there would have been a plaque listing 20 names. Here, there's a fountain and a bakery. You sit on a bench in Ypres, just Ypres, not a name etched into military textbooks, not a symbol of horror. Children chase ducks in the park. Someone's dog steals a baguette. No one's grandparents lie buried just beneath your feet. Historians still argue what becomes of cultural identity without a cataclysm to anchor it. Some say tragedy sharpens memory. Others argue joy makes people forget faster. But here, the absence of shared trauma creates a strange vacuum. No In Flanders Fields, no Wilfred Owen, no T.S. Eliot whispering about the wasteland. Instead, poets write about rain and boredom. and long walks that don't lead to the front. You leaf through a 1919 anthology titled Verses from the Edge of the Garden. It contains 300 poems about shrubs. The introduction praises a return to modest topics. One reviewer calls it heroically dull. You snort. There's no Remembrance Day, no Veterans Day, no poppy pins on lapels. Instead, national holidays remain cheerful, uncomplicated. Flags wave, but never drape over coffins. Bugles play, but they're out of tune and followed by fireworks. Military parades still exist, but they're less haunted. You watch one in Brussels, where the most solemn moment involves a marching band misfiring a confetti cannon. A child screams, then laughs, then demands another cannon. In literature, there is no lost generation. Fitzgerald still writes The Great Gatsby, but his characters are less bruised. Gatsby throws lavish parties not to erase trauma, but because he has too much money and too few hobbies. You pass a bookstore in New York where This Side of Paradise is on display with the tagline, "A novel about feelings and also nice sweaters." In Germany, no war poets gather in sanatoriums. No young men come home limping and disillusioned. The cultural mood is still heavy. It's Germany after all. But it's a heavy born of philosophy, not PTSD. Public monuments are fewer and far more eccentric. In Budapest, someone erects a bronze statue of a man taking a nap. The plaque reads, "To the unknown sleeper." You nod approvingly. The absence of mass grief doesn't mean peace reigns completely. It just means death remains personal, quiet, domestic. You attend a funeral for a shopkeeper in Milan. His family weeps. The town shows up. But no one turns it into a national metaphor. School children still learn history, but with different chapters. No trench warfare, no Christmas armistice, no Gallipoli. Instead, they memorize economic trends and squabble over the Crimean War. One student scrawls, "Bring back the exciting deaths," in his notebook. The teacher sighs, and then there's memory itself, slippery, rewritten constantly. Without the shared mourning of a generation, nostalgia takes on a different tone. People long for summers, not soldiers, for music halls, not munitions factories. The golden age becomes gold-tinted for different reasons. You find an elderly woman in Lyon holding an old photograph. It's not of a fallen son, it's her sister, dressed as a turnip in a 1913 harvest play. She smiles and says, "It was the most exciting week of our lives." You believe her. And in the soft dusk of a countryside that was never scarred, the poppies still bloom. But no one picks them. No one wears them. They're just there. Bright, gentle, and finally free of meaning. You tap your shoes on warm pavement as you cross into America again, this time into the rhythmic pulse of a decade, with flappers, fast talkers, and gin hidden behind bookshelves. The roaring 20s still roar, even without a war to recover from. But it is a different kind of roar, more like a saxophone warming up than a cannon clearing its throat. The jazz still plays, the parties still glitter, but there are fewer ghosts in the corners. In this peaceful version of the 1920s, the United States never sends its doughboys across the Atlantic. There are no returning heroes with empty eyes, no victory parades for a war that changed everything. And yet the post-war economic boom? It happens anyway, just less violently. You find yourself in Chicago, where the speakeasies are still crowded and the bootleggers still wear fedoras. A young man at the bar says, "I'm investing in toothpaste companies now. The future's clean." You toast to his optimism. Historians still debate whether the 20s would have been as roaring without the shock and relief of war's end. Some say trauma made people party harder. Others argue technology and credit were the real drivers. Here, without war, the excess still bubbles up, but from novelty, not nihilism. Women still dance in shorter skirts. Men still slick their hair with dangerous confidence. The Charleston catches on. Jazz bands bloom in basements and backyards, but the cultural undertone is playful, not desperate. You attend a poetry reading in Harlem. Langston Hughes is still writing, still breaking language like it's made of jazz notes. But his verses carry fewer shadows. He talks more about rivers and fewer about rivers of blood. The Harlem Renaissance flourishes. Without segregation in the military to stir protest, change comes slower. But art pushes forward anyway, not because of war, but because it refuses to sit still. In this world, F. Scott Fitzgerald is still disillusioned, but more confused than haunted. Gatsby still dies, but he's not a stand-in for a broken generation, just a guy who couldn't take a hint. You pass through a cinema in Los Angeles where early talkies are being tested. A director yells, "Cut!" after an actress accidentally refers to herself as an emoji. No one knows what it means, so they keep it. Wall Street still climbs. Credit still tempts. People still build dreams out of mortgages and whispers. You walk past a new tower being built in Manhattan. The foreman says, "We're making the sky permanent." You don't have the heart to correct him. There's a lightness to it all. Yes, prohibition still kicks in, because some ideas refuse to die. But the defiance is less moral outrage and more comedic theatre. You watch a milkman hand off gin bottles disguised as holy water. He winks. Everyone winks back. Without war, the cultural confidence is unbroken. The country doesn't limp into the decade. It sprints and stumbles and dances anyway. You find a jazz club in New Orleans that plays music so smooth it might as well be pouring out of the walls. A woman leans over and says, "No one here's seen a battlefield, but we all know how to survive a Wednesday." You nod. Gangsters still rise. Capone still smiles in photographs. But without war-era smuggling networks and wartime corruption, organized crime takes longer to organize. It's less empire, more franchise. On Wall Street, speculation builds. There's no war debt, no massive foreign loans, but people are still people, greedy, hopeful, slightly ridiculous. One broker you meet is trying to sell shares in future cheese. You don't ask questions, and yet the world feels lighter. The skyscrapers taller, the headlines sillier, the people, if not wiser, at least less haunted. Without war, the roaring Twenties roar for different reasons. Not because the world ended, but because it didn't. And as you watch fireworks explode over a beach in Atlantic City, a child points up and asks, "Is that what dreams look like when they're awake?" Maybe, maybe not. But at least tonight, no one has to forget to remember. You find yourself walking beside a dusty protest line, banners flapping lazily in the breeze. The year is still 1920-something, but the energy is different. Women in broad hats and sharp heels chant slogans in front of city halls from Boston to Berlin, but the tempo is slower. There was no great war to jolt society into action, no battlefield that proved women could do what men did, and then some. The fight for suffrage still happens, but it unfolds more like a political soap opera than a revolution. In this version of history, there are no wartime factory jobs to prove women's worth through industrial muscle. No munitions work, no uniforms, no trenches to support with bandages and quiet bravery. Instead, women organize through salons, newspapers, lectures, and a growing weariness with being told to wait their turn. You attend a suffrage rally in London's Hyde Park. The crowd is smaller than it might have been. Fewer angry signs, more picnics. One woman is giving a speech while feeding a pigeon from her glove. "Equality is not a reward for war," she says. "It is a birthright." The pigeon coos in agreement. Historians still argue whether suffrage would have arrived sooner or later without the war. Some claim war accelerated progress by necessity. Others believe women would have found power in peace, through patience and persistent protest. Here, it's the latter. Less adrenaline, more petitions. In the United States, the 19th Amendment still arrives, just a few years late. You drift through a smoky committee chamber where senators debate with the enthusiasm of sleepy lawyers. One shouts, "Next you'll want women in trousers." A woman in trousers watches from the gallery. She takes notes. In France, the delay is longer. Without the war to fracture tradition, conservatives hold the line. You witness a debate on the chamber floor where a senator solemnly insists French femininity is too delicate for the ballot. Someone throws a shoe at him. You silently cheer. But women adapt. They organize, they educate. In India, a group of women meets beneath a neem tree to plan a literacy campaign. One grandmother says, "We cannot read their laws if we do not read at all." She begins teaching the alphabet with her walking stick pressed into the dirt. In Germany, suffrage comes with caveats. First local, then national, then reluctantly complete. A Berlin newspaper runs a comic strip featuring a woman debating a banker about inflation while ironing. It's strangely popular. Fashion, too, shifts without war to speed it up. Corsets linger longer, hemlines rise more slowly. But eventually, freedom of movement becomes a fashion statement. You watch a Paris runway show where one designer sends models out barefoot to protest restrictive shoes and restrictive laws. The crowd claps, then removes their own shoes. Without wartime propaganda demanding that women fill in for absent men, there's no Rosie the Riveter, but there is Rosalie the Rail Clerk, who writes a column called The Velvet Revolution. Her most popular entry is titled How to Vote and What to Wear While Doing It. In the Soviet Union, yes, still percolating even without the war, women's rights are theoretically guaranteed early on. But you pass a factory in Petrograd where all the managers are men and all the secretaries are named Olga. One of the Olgas rolls her eyes at you and says, "It's a revolution, not a miracle." In Egypt, a woman named Huda organizes street protests with flowers pinned to her hijab. British officers don't know what to do about her, so they do nothing. The flowers bloom, slowly, quietly, deliberately. Women win ground, not all at once, not with headlines, but like ivy creeping up a wall that thinks it can't be climbed. You visit a university in Boston where a female physics professor is teaching a lecture on gravity. Someone asks her what it feels like to be the only woman in the department. She replies, "Heavy." You laugh. Later that evening, you watch a voting line snake down a cobbled street. Women in coats, women with babies, women with canes and cigarettes and questions. They don't look triumphant. They look tired, but satisfied. Without the war, the path was longer, but it was still walked one step at a time, in heels and boots and bare feet. You step into a room that smells faintly of bleach, iron and chalk, a hospital corridor in 1920s London. No sirens scream, no stretchers rush through doors. It's calm, almost too calm. The world never plunged into the industrial killing fields of World War I, and so modern medicine missed its most brutal boot camp. In this reality, the surgical advances born of horror arrive late, or not at all. You walk past rows of neatly made beds. Patients read newspapers, sip tea. There's no shell shock clinic here, no rows of men with missing jaws and eyes gone blank. You listen for the silence that follows trauma, and instead hear someone snoring. Without trench warfare, doctors never faced daily tests of triage and improvisation under fire. Battlefield medicine, the mother of countless innovations, is replaced by more cautious academic progress. Medicine grows slowly, safely, but not necessarily better. Historians still argue about this. Some insist that modern trauma care, blood transfusions, and antiseptic practices were forced into being by war. Others believe those advances were inevitable, just more polite without the pressure. Here, things are tidier, but slower. You peek into a surgical theatre in Vienna. The doctor lectures about abdominal wounds using a wax dummy. There's a long digression about the philosophy of pain. No one bleeds. No one learns anything quickly. Penicillin. still hanging out in Alexander Fleming's petri dish, but without wounded soldiers to infect and die, its potential stays hidden. You pass by his cluttered lab in London. He's currently cataloguing mold. He looks tired and mildly annoyed. Meanwhile, in America, the Red Cross still grows, but without a war to anchor its reputation, it focuses more on disaster relief and hygiene campaigns. You attend a lecture titled Soap Society's Silent Hero. There are pamphlets and an interpretive dance. Mental health, a mixed bag. No war means no wave of returning veterans with what will one day be called PTSD. Shell shock remains unstudied, unspoken, unacknowledged. Without trench trauma, psychology evolves as a luxury discipline. More couches, fewer breakthroughs. Freud is still publishing, of course, but he's arguing with his students about whether anxiety can be inherited from one's furniture. You sit in on a therapy session in Berlin. A man is upset because his wife keeps putting jam on the wrong side of the bread. The doctor nods solemnly. This is a deep metaphor, he says. It's not, but not everything stagnates. Public health, freed from the shadow of war, gets room to breathe. You visit a village in Wales, where a nurse teaches school children to wash their hands before meals. She uses a puppet named Sir Soapalot. The kids love it. One later becomes a sanitation engineer. The Spanish flu still happens, and its echoes push hygiene forward in ways no battlefield could. Hospitals expand, cities install better plumbing. One mayor in Florence starts a Clean Feet, Clean Mind campaign. It fails, but people remember it fondly. You wander through a pharmacy in New York, where the biggest seller isn't a T morphine, it's S aspirin. A woman asks the clerk, "What works best for a headache brought on by too many opinions?" The clerk replies, "Leaving." Vaccines still roll out, slowly. Without wartime logistics, distribution stays clunky. Smallpox still gets punched, but polio takes longer. You pass a school where iron lungs sit like sleeping robots, waiting for science to hurry up. Prosthetics? Less urgent. Without tens of thousands of amputees, innovation in limb replacement stagnates. You find a craftsman in Milan still carving wooden arms the old-fashioned way, elegant, functional, completely outdated. He shrugs. No one complains. Midwifery, though, thrives. Without war pulling doctors away, maternal care improves. You watch a birth in a Dutch clinic with wallpaper, jazz music, and a nurse named Trudy who delivers babies while whistling. The baby is named after her. She beams. And so medicine in this world moves not with a scream, but with a yawn. No trauma to catapult it forward, no urgency to unlock its secrets. Just slow, deliberate, sometimes absurd progress. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. You're back in the heart of Europe now, but this time your eyes are on balance sheets instead of battlefields. Without World War I to destroy economies, shatter currencies, and flood nations with war debt, the global economy takes a different path. Less like a boom and bust roller coaster, more like a series of polite, unpredictable stumbles. You walk into a Berlin bank. It's 1924, and instead of hyperinflation melting the wallpaper, the air smells of stale coffee and mild confusion. The mark still exists, still valuable, still slow to count. A clerk offers you a pamphlet titled "Saving Money Without a Wheelbarrow." It's a joke, but you can tell it wouldn't have landed in the other timeline. Without the war, the reparations never come. The Treaty of Versailles was never signed, and Germany is not on the hook for impossible payments. No Weimar collapse, no riotous inflation, just the same old economic issues Germany always had. Uneven growth, endless bureaucracy, and a tendency to build very nice things no one can afford. Historians still argue what peace would have meant for global finance. Some say the war-esque destruction was the only thing that shook the old economic systems out of their aristocratic coma. Others insist the chaos of reparations and debt made everything worse. In this version of history, the world doesn't get a wake-up call. It gets a slow, annoying buzz. In London, the gold standard limps on. Bankers argue over the wisdom of clinging to tradition while sipping brandy in tall-backed chairs. One mutters, "If it worked in 1815, it'll work now." Another replies, "So did powdered wigs." They glare at each other in silence. Across the Atlantic, America still rises, but more modestly. There's no flood of European war debt to call in, no sudden investment boom driven by post-war optimism. Instead, Wall Street grows like a well-fed house cat, sleek, overconfident, and completely unaware of how fragile its balance actually is. You sit in on a board meeting in Manhattan. A man with suspenders pitches an idea for a national chain of hotcake parlors. He's laughed out of the room. 2 years later, he's a millionaire. The stock market still crashes eventually. Humans remain human, and speculation remains a favorite sport. But the crash of 1929 in this world is smaller, more regional. Banks fail, but quietly. You walk past a newspaper kiosk in St. Louis with the headline, "Market slips, everyone shrugs." You visit a textile mill in Belgium where business is steady, wages are fairish, and management is confused by how little drama there's been this decade. The owner says, "We were prepared to rebuild, but there was nothing to rebuild." He sounds almost disappointed. Colonial economies benefit in the short term. With no war to divert resources, European empires invest more steadily in their overseas projects. Railroads in India, rubber plantations in Indochina, diamond mines in South Africa, all continue to churn profit without interruption. The moral stain remains. But the balance sheets look good. Meanwhile, local resistance movements grumble about taxation, not starvation. You listen to a Nigerian accountant in Lagos explain how colonial budgets are equal parts theft and incompetence. He gets applause, then silence, then more applause. Trade expands, slower but wider. You watch crates of silk unloaded in Marseille, coffee in Copenhagen, tin in Tokyo. With no U-boat campaigns or naval blockades, merchant shipping is just shipping, slightly soggy, occasionally mislabeled but remarkably peaceful. The League of Nations never forms, so there's no international trade watchdog. That's probably for the best. You read a memo from an Austrian economist suggesting that every country adopt a single currency called the unicoin. Udres laughed out of the room and later becomes the name of a children's cereal. The idea of global capitalism still thrives, but it lacks the trauma-forged momentum of post-war recovery. There's no Marshall Plan, no Bretton Woods, just slow agreements made over slightly bitter tea. You visit a village in the Swiss Alps where a merchant tracks his cheese exports with an abacus. He's been doing it since 1897. His son suggests using a ledger. The father refuses. "It is cursed," he whispers. The son sighs and opens a bank anyway, and so the global economy without war becomes a creature of habit, growing, wobbling, adjusting, but rarely reinventing itself. No miracle years, no lost decades, just a long, strange stroll through quiet prosperity and occasional boring crisis. It's not dramatic, it's not heroic, but it works, sort of. You stand now in a world that never built a League of Nations because it never needed one. The war that was supposed to end all wars never began. And without that trauma binding nations together in sorrow and ambition, the grand idea of international unity is left to philosophers and well-meaning pacifists with underwhelming funding. You drift into Geneva, where the buildings that would have housed the League are now mostly home to art exhibitions and occasionally confuse tourists looking for better signage. A dusty folder in a back room reads, "Preliminary Thoughts on a Council of Friendly Powers." It's dated 1920. It's also written in crayon. Woodrow Wilson, still alive, still lecturing, never pitches his 14 points to a war-weary world, because the world isn't weary, just mildly annoyed with itself. He talks about world peace, like a college student pitching a group project that nobody asked for. Congress nods, then moves on to tariffs. Historians still argue whether the League could have succeeded even in our own timeline. Was it doomed by design or by timing? Here, in a timeline without a war to unite the globe in mourning, the very need for such a league feels fuzzy. You attend a conference in Brussels titled Cooperation for the Curious. Half the attendees are philosophers, the other half are travel agents. They draft a 5-point plan to improve international relations. Point 4 is more postcards. It passes unanimously. Instead of collective security, the world leans on bilateral treaties, messy, overlapping, and deeply personal. You read one between Sweden and Belgium about cheese tariffs that somehow includes a clause about mutual goose migration research. Neither country has geese, but it sounded nice. There are still summits, still meetings, still quiet rooms full of men in suits politely saying, perhaps when they mean absolutely not. But there's no formal structure to it, no Geneva Covenant, no empty threat of collective action. You sit in on a British diplomatic meeting where the Foreign Secretary suggests forming a rotating dinner club between nations. With punch cards, he adds, he's promoted the next week. Peace is held together by inertia, not principle, by trade, not trust. Without a league, there's no international court to try war criminals, but also no war crimes on an industrial scale, at least not yet. The 20th century's most devastating tools haven't been tested. Nations still jockey, still threaten, but they haven't yet proven how far they'll go. In the Pacific, Japan eyes expansion. Without the League to scold it, there's no Manchurian crisis in 1931, but also no explicit green light to act. You sit in a Tokyo tea house where a general argues that international pressure is just people frowning across the ocean. His aide nods and writes it down. The United States, never having joined the League in any timeline, remains proudly aloof. Its foreign policy consists mostly of hope, distance, and the occasional tariff tantrum. You pass a senator in Washington reading a book titled Why We Should Mind Our Business and Everyone Else's Business. He's writing the sequel. In Africa and Asia, anti-colonial leaders organize slowly. Without the League's convenient hypocrisy to expose, they focus instead on literature and alliances. You attend a reading in Lagos where the speaker says, "Freedom is not granted, it is whispered into being." The applause is quiet, but heartfelt. Even the Red Cross evolves differently. Fewer mandates, less diplomatic pull. You see volunteers in Tunisia distributing blankets and malaria pamphlets under a banner that reads, "We're here because it's nice." It is. Without a League of Nations, peace is less idealistic, less scripted, and perhaps more fragile. There's no central body to raise alarm bells. No global table to pound fists upon, just diplomats, telegrams, and the hope that everyone continues to be slightly too tired for conflict. You find a note in a Berlin cafe napkin holder. It reads, "We don't need a league if no one starts a game." You smile. And yet, somewhere deep in the archives of an old Vienna library, a dusty scholar still sketches out blueprints for something better. He dreams of a council, a shared dream, a way to talk before shooting starts. He doesn't know it yet, but maybe, just maybe, he's ahead of his time. You feel a subtle pressure in the air as you drift forward in time, into the decade where, in our world, the drums would begin again, louder, darker, and faster. But here, in this gentler timeline, there is no Treaty of Versailles, no crushed Germany, no Hitler. And yet that doesn't mean the world is safe. It just means World War II doesn't look the same. You find yourself in the early 1940s. Europe is tense. Borders have held, mostly but only by habit. Colonialism still lingers. Nationalism still whispers. And technology, always eager to test its own teeth, hums quietly in the shadows. There's no Nazi Germany, no swastika flags snapping in the wind, but authoritarianism hasn't vanished. You sit in a Budapest cafe where a charismatic radio host talks about cultural purities and the science of patriotism. The crowd nods, half listening, more interested in the strudel. That's the danger. Nobody's paying full attention. Historians still debate whether World War II was inevitable or if it was simply a sequel written by the same hand that penned the first. In this version of events, the script is new, but the themes remain. You pass through a quiet Warsaw, untouched by blitzkrieg, but the city feels brittle, like old porcelain. Political parties fracture over small things. One newspaper argues that train schedules are a plot by the aristocracy. Another insists fish prices are the key to national rebirth. Italy, never dragged into the First War, doesn't fall under Mussolini, but it does flirt with a strange hybrid of monarchy and technocracy. You attend a symposium in Milan titled "How to be Modern Without Being French." It is 3 hours long and contains 2 operatic intermissions. In the Soviet Union, revolution still simmers, but it arrives differently. Lenin dies in relative obscurity, his ideas buried in pamphlets and bad coffee. Stalin never gets the machinery of state terror that a broken post-war Russia handed him. But another figure rises, a quieter man, focused more on surveillance than fear. He doesn't kill millions, he just watches them. And in East Asia, things still stir. Japan, never emboldened by its victories in World War I, still industrializes, still militarizes, still hungers. Without a League of Nations to frown ineffectively, there's no slap on the wrist for taking Manchuria, but no rubber stamp either. You walk through a Tokyo government building where a clerk stamps forms approving military research into oceanic influence zones. He doesn't know what that means. He doesn't care. In China, the civil war still burns, but with fewer foreign entanglements, the struggle stretches longer, dirtier, and more rural. You pass a hillside village where both sides have camped, on opposite sides of the same river. They wave, they yell, but they don't cross, not today. And in the United States, isolation remains fashionable. There is no Pearl Harbor in this world, no Roosevelt dragged into war by fire and wreckage, but there are whispers. You attend a congressional hearing where senators debate whether Japan's trade demands are aggressive or just poorly phrased. They vote to do nothing. The president signs a resolution titled, "Let's see what happens." Still, something's coming. You feel it in the way maps are redrawn behind closed doors, the way weapons are developed with no clear enemy. You watch a test of a new kind of bomb in the Nevada desert. The military calls it the Large Flash Surprise. The scientists don't smile. Without a First World War, the second doesn't arrive as a roar, but as a fog, a series of regional conflicts sparked not by treaties but by ambition. France and Spain argue over North African borders. Britain quietly sends ships to reinforce Cyprus. Argentina and Brazil begin a quiet arms race over air superiority. Someone invents a flying torpedo. It works once, then never again. And yet, no global cataclysm. Not yet. The world, for all its tensions, still remembers how not to burn. But that memory is fading. You watch a parade in Vienna, marching bands, flags, cheers. But beneath the music, something else, a brief pause, when a plane flies too low. Everyone stares, not in fear, just curiosity. And you wonder, is this how a war begins in a world that's forgotten how to be afraid? Not with thunder, not with speeches, but with a shrug. You float now through a twilight world where tension buzzes under the wallpaper. It's the late 1940s, and although there was no great war to flatten cities and polarize powers, suspicion still finds its way into the bloodstream of nations. Welcome to the Cold War, but in this timeline, it's not so cold, it's just lukewarm. No mushroom clouds, no iron curtain. Just frosted windows and nervous diplomats pretending to get along. You glide through Washington, D.C., where a hearing room buzzes with chatter, not about spies or atomic secrets, but about cultural subversion. The headline in the Washington Times reads, "Jazz musicians may be communists." A senator frowns at a trumpet. You chuckle. Without World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union don't emerge as binary giants atop a smoldering world. There's no Yalta, no Berlin Wall, no arms race born from Hiroshima's shadow. Instead, power is distributed, unevenly, uncomfortably, like a dinner party where no one wants to admit who's picking up the check. Historians still argue whether a Cold War was possible without the hot one before it. Some say the ideological clash was always coming. Others insist it was trauma and distrust that fanned the flames. In this alternate timeline, those flames remain sparks, nerve-wracking, but never explosive. You pass through Moscow, where a young bureaucrat named Mikhail organizes a chess tournament called Friendly Minds Across Borders. The Americans send their fifth best player. The Soviets win. Barely. They declare cultural superiority. The Americans say the food gave them headaches. There's still espionage, of course. You listen in on a telephone in Vienna, where a double agent discusses his favorite bakery more often than any state secrets. MI6 calls it Operation Frosted Crumb. It's surprisingly effective. In East Berlin, still whole, still not divided, you find a quiet apartment where an East German dissident broadcasts shortwave radio poems about tractors. The government listens, takes notes, does nothing. They're still trying to decode the metaphor. There are no proxy wars in Korea, no Cuban Missile Crisis, but smaller games play out. In Indonesia, two governments trade insults over trade routes and dance customs. In Africa, French and British diplomats fight not with troops, but with radio-funded cooking shows. It's petty and delightful. You walk through a Nairobi school where children learn 3 languages and how to spot propaganda. One child raises her hand and asks, "If both sides lie, who's right?" The teacher responds, "You are, for asking." The nuclear bomb? It exists, eventually. Developed not in secrecy, but in slow, calculated steps. You witness a test in the Nevada desert, smaller, quieter, and far more debated. Without Hiroshima to set precedent, the ethics of the bomb become a permanent philosophical loop. No one wants to use it. Everyone wants to own it, like a gun kept under the pillow of history. Meanwhile, television arrives. Without the post-war consumer boom, it takes longer to spread. But once it does, it shapes opinion more softly. You watch a news broadcast in Tokyo where 2 anchors politely disagree about whether capitalism is a hairstyle. No one changes the channel. Cultural competition becomes the new battleground. Ballet versus jazz, space travel versus crossword puzzles. You attend an international fair where the Soviet pavilion features grain efficiency diagrams and the American booth offers free hamburgers. Guess who wins? Hollywood still makes propaganda films, but they're subtler. One romantic comedy involves a CIA agent who falls in love with a KGB officer over their shared love of pigeons. It wins an award. Somewhere, both governments issue very polite complaints. There's no Berlin airlift, no Warsaw Pact, but embassies get bigger. Passports get stricter, and everyone learns how to smile without showing their teeth. The Cold War doesn't erupt, it lingers. Less nuclear countdowns, more passive-aggressive memos, like a global roommate standoff over who left the light on, and yet somehow it works. No one wins, but no one dies by the millions either. And as you drift above the earth, still spinning, still uneasy, you whisper a thought to no one in particular. Sometimes the worst wars are the ones we prepare for, but never need. You find yourself above a city skyline at dusk. Could be London, Tokyo, São Paulo. Everything looks familiar. Cars hum. Streetlights flicker on. Someone is arguing with a vending machine. It's the modern world, but it's not your modern world. It's slightly askew, like a dream you remember incorrectly. This is the 21st century in a world where World War I never happened, and everything feels tilted. You walk past a coffee shop where a group of students debate something called neoclassical neo-minimalism. One of them wears a shirt that reads, "Make Versailles boring again." No one laughs, but everyone nods. Without the two world wars to reshape the planet's infrastructure, political systems, and economic priorities, history has built a different skyline. It's shorter in some places, taller in others. You stare at a Rome where fascism never ruled, a Moscow that never quite boiled over, and a Berlin that was never split in two. Historians, still very much a thing, argue whether this world is better or just less obviously damaged. Some say peace allowed for slow prosperity. Others insist war's horror was a kind of dark surgery, removing old tumors by force. In this version of history, the tumors stayed. They just got rebranded. Technology advanced, yes, but unevenly. Without the hyper-industrial acceleration of wartime innovation, much of the tech you'd expect arrived at a stroll, not a sprint. You check your phone, it's larger, heavier, and only has 3 apps. One is a piano simulator that crashes constantly. The camera is excellent, though. Everyone's obsessed with photographing clouds. Air travel is still expensive, still glamorous. You fly on a German-built airship called Der Himmelsläufer that serves coffee in porcelain and plays jazz through hidden speakers. It takes 10 hours longer than a jet, but you're not mad about it. The internet exists, but more fragmented. Without a Cold War to push DARPA into overdrive, the global web emerged slowly, built from private enterprise and university collaborations. You visit a library in Nairobi where scholars are uploading rare manuscripts 1 page at a time. It's slow, but sacred. Social media never becomes the global monolith it is in your timeline. Instead of 5 mega platforms, there are hundreds of niche networks. You sign into Treehouse, a popular Dutch app where people trade gardening advice and philosophical hot takes. One post reads, "If a tree falls in the metaverse, should it monetize?" Governments function differently. In the absence of war-forged unity, supranational alliances are more philosophical than practical. The European Union never forms. Instead, there is the Continental Fellowship Accord, a loosely affiliated network of cultural and economic partners who send each other a lot of postcards and argue about cheese tariffs. You sit in on a meeting where Portugal and Norway debate the definition of sustainable pastries. It lasts 4 hours. America remains powerful, but it never becomes the superpower. China rises, but more slowly, its internal revolutions playing out with fewer outside catalysts. Russia lingers in permanent adolescence, too big to fall, too unsteady to lead. There's no United Nations, but there is a biannual event called the Planetary Roundtable, hosted in different cities, where world leaders gather, not to agree on anything, but to try not to offend each other. You attend one in Seoul. The keynote speaker is a robot who recites poetry. The applause is confused but warm. Culturally, the world is more pluralistic. With fewer wars to centralize narratives, more voices get through. You hear lullabies in 4 languages before breakfast. The top movie in cinemas is a silent love story between a Romanian beekeeper and a Martian. No one questions it. And yet, this peaceful world is not without stress. There are still economic crashes, still populists with loud microphones, still climate concerns, still border disputes, still the deep human ache of wanting more. But there are also more benches, more libraries, more time to think, because fewer monuments had to be built out of grief. You pause on a hill overlooking Prague. Below you, people live, not perfectly, not painlessly, but without a century of war echoing in their bones. And for a moment, the modern world feels less like a scar, more like a painting still in progress. The night deepens now, and you walk slowly, not through a city, not through history, but through something quieter. The outline of a life. Yours. Or rather, the life you'd be living if World War I had never happened. At first glance, not much seems different. The sky is still black velvet, stretched across the heavens. A breeze rustles the trees. Somewhere, a dog barks at a thought it doesn't quite trust. But you begin to notice the absences, not just of wars, but of the echoes they leave behind. You pass a family dinner in a small town in Belgium. The grandparents laugh, together. In your world, one of them never made it home from the Western Front. But here, they argue about onions. It's glorious. You drift through a university in Krakow, where a student scribbles a thesis about memory in architecture. The building is older than it should be. No bombs ever touched it. The plaster still has fingerprints from a century ago. The classroom has no bullet holes, just chalk dust. You ride a tram through Sarajevo, no memorial, no plaque. Just a statue of a musician playing the guzzle, grinning toward the mountains. The driver hums along. You realize he has no idea what a world war even is. Historians in this timeline still teach about conflict, yes. Napoleon, the 30 Years' War, but nothing like what you knew. No industrialized grief, no nations ground down to dust, rebuilt, then crushed again. Without the war, the 20th century wasn't erased. It was rewritten, less centralized, less dominated by trauma, less loud. Your family tree changes. Perhaps an uncle never lost his leg, a cousin never fled. A grandmother never sat silent in the kitchen, watching water boil with 1,000-yard stare. Peace trickles down like water through rock, shaping everything without needing to shout. Your favorite writer is different. Your city's layout is slightly off. The president's name isn't the one you remember. And you're a little more rested, a little less brittle. Because when the foundations of the world shift, everything built on top of them bends in new directions. You step into a bookstore, the owner waves. He says you always come in this time of night. He pulls a book from the shelf, a collection of letters between lovers who never had to say goodbye from a battlefield. You open it and find a pressed poppy. No names, just a date, July 1914. It's pristine. You walk the streets of your alternate life. No trenches in the soul, no silence that roars. Just the hum of electricity, the sound of a world that never shattered and glued itself back together with bitterness and guilt. And still, even here, life is not perfect. There are arguments, broken hearts, lost opportunities. People still get sick, still die, still forget to say what matters until it's too late. But fewer songs are written in minor keys. Fewer faces are hollowed by what they've seen. And when children play soldier, they stop before it becomes habit. In this world, you don't have to wonder what peace looks like. You're walking through it, breathing it in, leaving footprints across a history that never caught fire. And as you reach the end of this long path, you look up at the stars. They're the same stars above the same earth. But here, the ground beneath your feet never cracked open. And the world, for once, never forgot how to hold itself gently. And now, as the story fades, the world you've wandered through begins to settle. The city's quiet. The fields grow still. The people you've passed, so vivid, so nearly real, gently fold back into shadow. You sit now, wherever you are, with the soft hum of what-ifs still lingering around your shoulders. This was a world without the First World War. Without mud-soaked trenches or shaking hands writing goodbye letters, without lines drawn in blood that never washed away. But it was also a world of its own fragilities, of delayed lessons, of untested heroes. Of peace, yes, but peace that took longer to understand its value. Let your breath slow now. Feel the calm in your chest, the way your body sinks into your mattress or your chair, the way silence wraps around you like a blanket that remembers your shape. Outside, maybe there's wind or rain or nothing at all, but inside, here, with this voice still with you, you are safe, drifting not into darkness, but into softness, Take this quiet with you. Let your thoughts drift where they will. You don't need to hold on to the story anymore. It's already part of you, and now you can let it go. Close your eyes, let the world grow quiet, and sleep well, traveler.